Hi, my name is Kevin and I collect old irons. There are various personalities associated with the subject of old irons, and we will talk about some of these people each in their turn. But nobody is as important as Mrs. Florence Potts, a person who in the 1870s and through the 1880s was maybe the second most famous woman in the world. To begin, Florence was her middle name. Her first name was Mary, and she signed her patents as Mary F. Potts, that being her formal name. But she otherwise signed her name M. Florence Potts, and I think that was how she was known to family and friends. And all of us interested in pressing iron history are part of her family, and I will here refer to her as Florence. Here is the well-known and quite common portrait of Mrs. Potts. This is, we think, circa about 1883. And here is the back, the Mrs. Potts cold-handled sat-iron. These cards are quite common, and there's quite a well-established trade card community. They have conventions and so forth. And these cards are widely collected. There are variations of the front, and there are many variations of the back. This particular card comes from Portland, Maine. But there is another, lesser-known trade card illustration of her. This illustration is not as complimentary as the previous, more idealized presentation. Here she looks older and haggard. But this is actually an earlier image. The back is associated with other earlier Potts trade cards, and we'll say more about these trade cards in a later video. This image is from the late 1870s, and at that time she was not yet 30 years old. The image suggests that she had a tough life. We don't know a lot about Mrs. Potts of a personal nature. There were no contemporary biographies, no diary that I know of. She was born in 1850, she died in 1922. She had 6 children. She deserves a better biographer than me. Florence had gumption. She saw the ironing process in the late 1860s. These were flat irons and slug irons. We've seen these in previous videos. They tended to have a flat back. She thought there must be a better way. And what she did in 1870 is she published a patent that had a double pointed design. And that was quite the novelty in that day, and what she did literally changed her world. The flat backs were used to set up the irons in front of the fire to heat the bottoms. That fireplace was a busy environment, as shown here. Note the irons here are on the mantel ready for later use. We might add that the #1 cause of female mortality during that time was childbirth, but very possibly the second major cause of death was being burned alive after the dress caught on fire while working around the open fireplaces. By the 1860s, flat-top stoves became available, and so there was no longer a need for a flat back to the flat iron. So Potts patented a point on each end that allowed easier movement to the front and back. What an idea! This patent came out in May 1870. Wait a minute. She was born in November 1850. She was 19 and a half years old when this patent came out. She, as I said, had gumption. She was already married at the age of 17, married to a disabled Civil War veteran who was 17 years her senior. Young men were hard to find in those days. She'd already had a child at age 18, that being a son, Acero. What a story! And she followed that up in 1871 with a second patent for a very simple detachable handle. Here is the patent drawing. The design presented here is quite elaborate, and this patent presents the whole Mrs. Potts iron as we know this today. This had a wood semicircular handle attached by screws to a stretcher recessed into the base. The base included a cross piece The handle included a hook-type latch that pivoted with a spring and engaged the base, which could easily be switched to another. We saw some of the early detachable handled irons in the third video. Mrs. Potts' design was sophisticated and drastically changed the process of ironing. This is a picture of the original patent model for the Mrs. Potts iron. The model is now at the Franklin Pierce Law Center Library in New Hampshire. A faculty member there collected patent models. As soon as COVID is over, I will go down there and we will see this more closely. There were two people that assisted Florence in her work on these patents. The first of these was Joseph H. Weber, who was a witness on the first patent and also her father. Joseph Weber was a plasterer and must either have shown her or taught her or helped her in the making of plaster molds, which would then be sent to the foundry. Also her husband, Joseph Potts, who had only shortly before had a patent approved for a bed spring design and would have been of much help, I think, in Florence's patent. Joseph Potts was an assistant engineer on board the Civil War monitor USS Saugus, which saw combat on the James River and opposite Fort Fisher. Fort Fisher is where black soldiers from the Boston area famously demonstrated their bravery. Joseph Potts may well be in this photo, taken by Matthew Brady, who took other pictures as well of the Saugus crew. Mr. Potts thus had both technical and patent experience to help Florence. But Mary Florence Potts was the sole patentee. The ideas, and the drive at least, were hers. Now, having an idea, a patent, and a manufacturer are quite separate things. The Potts tried to market these things on their own, but that did not work well. And so they ultimately turned to the Isaac Chalfant Manufacturing Company in 1872, which bought half of the Potts patent for $1,500. She used 1,000 of these dollars to pay off debts. Here are two photos of early Chalfant irons, probably made between 1872 and 1875. A Chalfant and Potts company was established, and Florence was promised a portion of the profits. But while Chalfant made many irons, they never gave her any money and left her family destitute. Florence had neither the experience nor the money to seek legal recourse. Florence was a woman in a man's world. On October 26, 1875, Florence sold the other half of her patent to the Enterprise Manufacturing Company for $800. She was desperate. Chalfant later sold its portion of the Potts patent to American Machine Company, and Enterprise and American Machine Company thereafter worked pretty closely together. Enterprise had a display of these irons at the 1876 Philadelphia Centennial Exhibition World's Fair, and this picture is of the Woman's Pavilion, where I assume Enterprise had their display. Some of the irons that Enterprise had in this display are now in the Smithsonian. And here is where Enterprise began its famous marketing of the Mrs. Potts irons. At or not long after the Centennial display, Enterprise began to give away these small irons as promotional items. And, of course, Enterprise marketed the Mrs. Potts name and image on many trade cards. These cards must have been made in the millions, and again we'll talk about these in greater detail at another time. Enterprise sold a lot of irons and licensed the design to manufacturers in England, America, and elsewhere. American companies that used the Mrs. Potts patent include the Bless and Drake, Cleveland, Colebrookdale, and Williams companies. Once the patents ran out in the late 1880s, many companies made their own interpretations of this design, often adding small innovations that were patented. In 1893, Florence and her company filed a joint patent that inserted a wedge on the two sides of the stretcher, perhaps in an attempt to recapture the magic or maybe gain some control of her invention. But by that time, many companies such as Colebrookdale were simply continuing the use of the old molds, and everyone else had their own little patented improvements. As far as I know, the 1893 patent was not produced. So let's look at some of the Mrs. Potts style irons from the 1890s and later. We'll start off with some irons that very much have the Mrs. Potts style shape with the semicircular handle. This particular one is a William Howell design. This one is marked patent October 1894. But for this one, the top simply rotates 90 degrees. It lifts off very easily. And Here is a later, circa 1905 patent. Same basic kind of design here, except that here we have a crank that rotates the underside without the need for rotating the handle. And there are a variety of others. This one has a vertical crank. No patent date, no markings, so the manufacturer is unknown. And here is another one that has a latch here you push forward. Again, no patent, and these handles seem to be found with a variety of different bases, suggesting perhaps that these handles were marketed and you can mix or match them with whichever manufacturer wanted to use. Let's take a look at a couple of more. These are exclusively small size. This is a Banwell 1895, has two pegs on the bottom. One is manipulated by the pole, the other is stationary with two holes on the inside. This is a Boughton 1898. Has a very simple latch mechanism, but something quite different than what we're usually seeing with the Mrs. Potts style irons. That you might note the stickers on this. This iron was originally in the collection of Carol Walker, and she actually used this iron in one of her Iron Talks magazine articles, and she left these stickers here, and I retain these stickers as part of the provenance of this particular iron. Let's look at some Mrs. Potts style irons whose handles are a little bit different than what we're generally seeing in the Potts family. This particular one has a handle patented in 1910 called the Universal, and this is advertised in the Enterprise catalogs. And I think what happened was that Enterprise made these handles and was able to make them in large numbers very cheaply and sold them probably by the gross to other foundries who made the bases and then just added these handles, which were relatively more difficult for them to make. This particular base is a Griswold, again 1910. This is a Gibson handle. Again, I think the handles may well have been sold separately from the bases, and these are patented, number patents 1921, 1922. And this is an iron that was advertised without a company name, advertised as the Potts Streamlined iron, so still retaining the Potts name. And this one, as you might tell by the streamlined shape here, comes from the late 1920s into the 1930s. Values for these irons are surprisingly inexpensive. You can probably get any one of these with a little bit of looking around for in the realm of $20 to maybe $50. As far as we can tell, Florence did not benefit markedly beyond the initial $800 provided by Enterprise. In fairness to Enterprise, Florence may have naively signed over all the rights. In 1888, with the coming end of the original patent, Enterprise applied for an extension. And let's keep in mind that this patent was extremely valuable, surely Enterprise's most famous product. An adverse report was submitted February 15th, 1888, before the Committee on Patents and published in the Congressional Record. We thank Dennis for this morsel. And this reads, "The committee, in view of the facts presented, and in the firm belief that the extension of said patents would be a financial gift to the Enterprise Manufacturing Company, in which the applicant would share but very slightly, can see no reason why, for the alleged benefits of Mrs. Potts, the people at large should be compelled to pay tribute to her prospective assignees. The committee therefore report the bill adversely and recommend that it lie upon the table." So at least some justice was served. The patent was not extended, which is why there is such a variety of subsequent irons that do follow closely the Potts design. Joseph Potts died in 1901. Florence and her son Acero owned the Potts Manufacturing Company, which made optical goods, and I assume this means glasses, until her death in Baltimore in 1922. Let me finish this sad iron video by saying that this is not a sad story. Florence Potts was a great American. She is a hero to those of us who study pressing irons. She epitomized the entrepreneurial spirit and the importance of pressing irons in those days. It is incumbent upon us to preserve this history. With that said, let me ask you to subscribe, to send any comments to me or questions if you have them, and we have a lot more to talk about.